Welcome to Real Life Mentoring, where we explore real life issues to help you make an authentic difference in the world.
Hi, everyone. This is Chris with the Real Life Mentoring Podcast. My normal partner and wife, Christina, is not with me today. She's on sabbatical, but a friend and colleague, Micheal Gerecke, is with me, and we're going to be talking about an interesting topic, I think, for many people, but normally we don't talk about it, and it's death. And so, Micheal, thank you for joining me today. And here's the title that I gave it: Death, Perspective, and Real Life. So anyway, that you would sit back and just listen and be open to this topic as we talk about death, aspects of it, some relationships that we've known, people who have died, and most importantly, what God says about it. So anyway, Micheal, there's a couple of things, I guess I would call them facts or just statements I put down. We are all going to die physically at some point. And it's so bizarre to me. I know this, but I don't know it because I don't think of myself as dying sometimes. Like I'm going to be good to go. I know you and I, we really care about fitness and nutrition, and we take care of ourselves for the most part. And yet, that's not going to keep us from dying, is it? It's just not.
No.
So we're all going to die, but I really, my brain doesn't go there some days. And another point, it is uncomfortable for many people to talk about death. I know this is a perspective, but why do you think that is? What comes to mind?
Well, yeah, I just think it's uncomfortable. We just don't want to think that our life's going to end. I think there's probably some fear associated with what comes after that. There's probably some fear associated with how it's going to happen. And there's a whole lot of unknown around death.
Okay, so when you think about your own death, do you think about more like how it's going to happen? Is that would that cause you fear more or uncertainty? If that's even a fair way to say it.
Yeah, I think that's probably in regards to what would cause me stress or anxiety or worry if I were to sit and wonder about it.
Okay.
Or maybe the better question is if I could know one thing for sure, date, time, or anything like that, I'd like to know how.
Would you really?
I think so.
Wow.
I think so.
See, I don't want to know how I'm going to die. and I don't know, I don't want to know the day, but I just had this thought. There's some people, we're going to die instantly in some kind of situation. Some people are given maybe some notice, they have an illness, and they're told, based on our research and other people with your situation, you probably have about this long to live. Again, They can't give you the exact date, but some people actually can walk into that aspect of their lives with some planning. That's interesting too.
Yeah, and that might be, it'd be interesting to talk to someone who's going through that and know if that alleviates their discomfort in any way or if that raises their anxiety. And it probably is related to a lot of what we're going to end up talking about. And
sure.
Where they're coming from. But
okay.
Yeah, I think it's just something we avoid. I think it's really easy, especially in our day and age, to avoid talking about it because you can fill your life with lots of distractions and lots of things that need to be done and things that we want to do. And sitting down and talking about the world going on without you and you dying is not usually the top of the list for a lot of people.
That's an interesting statement. I don't want to, the thought of seeing my family go on without me makes me sad initially. And yet I know I'm going to be so much better off in eternity with God because of my faith in Jesus. Mm-hmm. But there's something about that kind of, it tweaks my brain. And maybe when people have younger children, like you still have two sons at home. My 3 daughters are all grown. And yet when I think about my own death, I think about how my family, the grieving they will go through if I go first. Mm-hmm. And that's something I don't like at all, but it's a part of it. Well, if you may be wondering, why is a podcast that's based on mentoring talking about death today? Well, at Fahrenheit Real Life Mentoring, we take the holistic approach. And so we train people to be effective mentors. In order to do that, we believe you need to address the whole person. And so we're talking about death because there are 6 areas we look at in mentoring. We are spiritual, physical, mental, emotional, relational, and professional or educational. Each of these areas impact the others, and they all have a place. They're all important to talk about at some point. So there's also a tool that we've developed called My Life, My Story. And in this tool, it's very simple. We look at the past of someone, the present, and the future. Micheal, until recently, as I've gone over this tool so many times, I don't know that I've thought about death with someone's future.
Mhm.
When I think about the future, I tend to want to be positive. In the future, I'm going to have this or be able to do this or experience this. And then recently, I'm going to say, God pretty much held me accountable. Chris, you need to start talking with men that you mentor about death. It's part of their future and
Mhm.
it's yours as well. And that's not a morbid thing. It's like, wow, okay, God, I want to help and encourage people through mentoring to think about their future. Yeah, things they can grow in and develop, but also we've got to talk about death to make the picture whole. Anyway, so, all right, looking at my notes, you sent me some notes recently as we prepared for this episode, and you gave me something called memento mori or mori, how you pronounce it. Talk about that if you would.
So I think it comes from it's Latin. Memento mori basically just means remember that you're going to die. Remember that you will die. And tradition says that when Roman generals would come back to Rome after victorious battles or whatnot, they'd be greeted with a parade. They'd be greeted in celebration. And but riding behind them in the chariot, they would have somebody whispering to them, basically, memento mori. Remember that you're going to die. And so
Okay.
all of this praise or celebration, but balance it with the fact that you're going to die. This will end. I think in recent years there's been a rise in awareness of like stoic thinking. There's been a couple writers. There's a writer named Brian Halliday who's gotten a lot of recognition for writing about stoicism, and so this thought kind of comes from that train of thinking of training your mind to remember what is real, remember what is true. And so for me, especially coming from a faith perspective, there's no reason to avoid the idea of death or to avoid remembering that this life is temporary. I think that's taught all throughout the Bible, and it can actually be a very positive thing to remind ourselves that life is short, and to balance whatever is going on, whether it's good or bad, with that recognition, just like you said, of the fact that we're all going to die at some point. It's not nobody gets out of this alive. It's kind of a funny way to say it. So yeah, it's nothing new. The idea of talking about death, I think, is nothing new. I think they probably did it much better thousands of years ago when death was more in your face than it is now. We can kind of hide death in a lot of ways or postpone it. And I'm glad that we have medical care, and I'm glad that we have doctors, and a simple infection doesn't kill us anymore. But
we're still dying,
but we're still mortal. Yeah.
and
still
we're
dying.
going to.
So
A few years ago, you gave me a book that began stirring some of this in me, and it's called "Let's Talk About Death Over Dinner" by Micheal Hebb. And so I want you to talk about, I think, with the loss of your father, is that what stirred you to find this book and read it? I don't remember.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Honestly, I'm not sure where we found the book. I think it was something that my wife Christy and I found walking through Half Price Books, or she may have read about. I don't know. She may have heard about it on a podcast. But anyway, we heard about it from somewhere and checked it out, and it's basically this
Interesting.
guy.
It's an interesting concept.
Yeah, and he organizes. He'll organize dinners for small groups of people, and he does a really good job of explaining how to organize it and how to make everybody feel like they're a part of it and they're involved. But the theme of the dinner is to get together and talk about death, because most people don't have an opportunity to do that. Most people don't have either the place to have that conversation, or they don't have the people that are willing to do it. And so by organizing a dinner, you kind of force the theme on everybody. I mean, they know what's going to happen when they show up. It's not a surprise,
Right?
but
And well, just to
but
clarify,
by being
we're
intentional,
not asking people to dress in black, and there's not a black tablecloth and thing. It's nothing weird like that. It's like let's sit down to a nice meal, but we're going to have a specific agenda, right?
yeah. I mean, it almost be the same way if you meet with your financial planner, and they're going to talk
Wow.
to you
Okay.
about when you retire or when you pass away, what do you want to leave behind? And so it's a way of having a conversation, very directed and deliberate conversation with your friends about about things that are important, things that matter.
That resonates for me very much so. I like how you said that. It's like meeting with a financial planner. All right, take it into your personal perspective on this with the loss of your father.
Hmm.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Yeah. So my dad passed away September 11th, 2012. So it's been a little over 12 years now. He was in he was in good health. We were still living overseas. We went back to the States to visit what we thought we were going to spend some time with family.
Okay.
And really pretty much when we arrived, he was in the hospital with colon cancer, and he passed away 3 months later. So it wasn't the trip home that we were expecting at all.
Okay.
To
How
say
long
the
did he
least.
know? I'm sorry. How long did he know he had cancer before he died?
I think the whole thing was probably about 4 months, because when we arrived in June, would have been middle of June, was when he first went to the hospital. So he may have known something was going on before that. He
Sure.
probably did,
Okay.
and just put off going to the hospital or going to see a doctor, thinking it would go away. And yeah, it was a whole series of things that shouldn't have happened. But yeah, 3.5 months later, he was gone. He passed away. So it was really quick. So yeah, I mean, thinking about that and thinking about grief, you and I have talked about grief some. I think grief is almost like a friend or an acquaintance that you don't want to meet and you put off as long as you can. But
Yes.
once you meet once you meet him, or he comes into your life, he's there forever. And so there's definitely days when I still think about my dad every day, because I grieve. The moment someone passes away or the moment they die, you grieve instantly them being gone.
Okay.
So everything is past. This is just kind of what I'm thinking about in my head. But as since then, in the last 12 years, I've had kids go to college. I've started the business. We've had another son, and we've moved homes. And our life has gone on, and those are all things that I grieve my dad not being able to be a part of. Those are all things that I could have used his experience and his wisdom, could have used his input on talking to him, and mostly just I would have enjoyed him being a part of it.
Mm.
And so grief is just ongoing, and it's a little duller now than it was 12 years ago. But it's almost like walking on with a rock in your shoe. Like sometimes you take a step and you feel it really hard and it hurts. But most of the time you're walking and you're aware that it's there, and it's kind of a dull pain. But it's like a rock that you can never take out of your shoe. Like it's just there, I think, for the rest of your life. That's at least that's the image I have in my head of
Okay.
how
I
it
think
works. That's how it's played out in my life.
that
Um,
resonates with me. Was your father the first significant relationship in your life that died? Who died?
yeah, so both my grandfathers passed away when I was really young, so one or
Okay.
two, and then my grandmothers died when I was older. I loved them; they were great, but we didn't live in the same town as them, so we would visit them. They
Sure.
weren't like a daily presence. Yeah, so my dad was the first one to die. Who it was, for lack of a better term, like it was just in my face every day.
Okay.
I would go home and he wasn't there. Even now, I I talk to people here and they ask, where's your family from? And I say, my mom lives in San Antonio. It's just her. It's not my dad.
Okay.
There's a void that's still there. So yeah, he was the first one to pass away that I felt that with.
It's interesting. I've experienced things like this. It's simple things, but they can really settle in your mind and heart. It's like you set the
Hmm.
table for dinner, and you go, "Oh, we don't need to set that extra the third plate." It's
Yeah.
things like that that we take for granted and go, "Wow." I mean, it's humbling. It really is. And I've had significant loss as well, and yet it's interesting how I'm going to give God credit. He walks me through it,
Hmm.
and it doesn't mean my grief is gone, as yours is not gone. It's just how would you describe it? The grief is not gone. Is it just what do you say? Because the
I mean, I
illustration
think
of the
it's
rock and the shoe makes sense.
yeah. I mean, I think it's lightened. I think for a while I had a lot of people who would ask about my dad really soon after he passed away, um, about his faith and how certain I was of where he was. and I have peace with my dad being with God, being in heaven. Like I have total peace with that. But it still rubbed me the wrong way because, well, for two reasons. One, if I didn't have that peace, what are you doing? You're just twisting the knife in the wound. Like
Okay.
if you don't know me well enough to know that, and you have to ask someone to ask them how do they feel about the eternal status of their loved one, and they're not sure, then
Okay.
that's not gonna. I don't think that's gonna help. I don't know. I don't know. For me, it struck me kind of as a rude question. And then, secondly, having that, yes, it makes it easier, but it doesn't make me feel grief any less.
Okay.
If that
That's
makes any
fair.
sense.
It does.
So I still miss my dad. I have peace with where he is, but I still wish he was here. I still wish I could talk to him. So yeah, I mean, I think the having faith and having knowing that my dad had faith, it shifts the conversation. It makes it, I guess, it makes it less permanent. It gives me hope for sure.
Okay.
It gives me a sense of comfort and gives me a sense of peace. But I think sometimes the tendency then is to kind of wash over it and say, okay, well then everything's okay. And it's like it's really not. You know, Jesus wept when Lazarus died, even though he knew he was going to go raise him from the dead
Okay.
in just a day and a half. You know, like he was on his way to raise him from the dead, and he still took time to weep for his friend. I think there's a place for feeling deep grief and feeling sadness and feeling loss, and I think that's okay. I think that's how you're supposed to grieve. At least should be part of the process.
I won't speak for other
And
cultures, even though I've lived in another culture, but
mm-hmm,
my perspective, the American culture, it's so strange sometimes in that how we push grief aside, and because we're two men talking about this, sometimes when a man shows emotion, when he shows grief in a way that signifies some weakness, actually, I think
mm-hmm,
it's just the opposite, Michael. The grief is there. If someone says, "No, I'm not grieving this loss of a person," that's just not that's not true. We have grief, and to be able to let it come out on the surface is incredibly
mm-hmm,
healthy, and it actually helps you in the future. A friend of a friend who recently lost his mom, and we had this conversation, and he was just talking, wanting to talk through some things, and I sent him a message just saying, "Hey, I just want to affirm you. It takes courage and it takes strength for you to walk through this grief instead of pushing it aside."
well,
Several
you asked
years
me about me, so yeah.
say that
What's been
again.
your experience? No, I was
Well,
gonna say,
my
what's been your
experience,
experience? Because you asked me about me and my father. I know you've had
I've
similar
lost
experiences.
I've lost both of my parents. I wasn't close to my father,
Mm-hmm,
so the death was interesting. I had actually thought about him. God had brought him to my mind. We were living in Austria. I'd not seen my dad in about a year. Again, we weren't close, but I cared for my dad, but we were never close.
mm-hmm,
And so I'm sitting at my desk in our apartment there, and I began to just have these thoughts. It's like watching a movie. And I believe what God did for me, He prepared me for my dad's death. I began to think about my dad, and
mm-hmm.
I thought, well, when will my dad die? What will it be like when he dies? How will he die? Will I what? How will I grieve because we weren't close? So I thought, and would I speak at his funeral? Would I not? What would I say? All of these thoughts went through my mind. Michael, that was on a Tuesday morning, and he died that following Saturday unexpectedly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So God had literally prepared me for my dad's death. That helped. I actually pre-grieved my dad's
yeah.
death without even realizing it because as I'm sitting there at the desk in that apartment that morning, I actually wept some. And I thought, this
Mm-hmm.
is so strange. And then I got up from the desk after about 45 minutes and thought, well, what was that about? And then about 4 days, 5 days later, I received a phone call that my dad had sat down in his chair and
Mm-hmm.
died instantly.
Mm-hmm.
So I did speak at my dad's funeral. I was able to say some things that were respectful and honest at the same time. And it's interesting. God helped me to pre-grieve ahead of time.
Yeah, yeah.
I was with my mom actually when she died a few years ago. She had been ill and hospice had been called in, and I got to her little apartment 10 minutes before she died. I mean, we didn't know how soon she was going to die. It could be
Mm-hmm.
any day, but I got there to sit with her and just be with her. And I said goodbye to the caretaker that morning. And within 10 minutes of me arriving, she took her last breath, and I saw her take her last breath. And I remember
Yeah.
thinking, by the way, I was actually quoting the 23rd Psalm over her as she was
Mm-hmm.
lying there. And as I got to the very end, her chest quit moving.
Hmm.
I looked at her. I thought, God, did you just take my mom? It was bizarre. I thought, am I making this up in my mind? As I finished quoting that scripture, she quit breathing. So I
Yeah.
put the blood pressure monitor on her arm just to see, and it went flat instantly.
Yeah.
That may sound creepy or strange to some people. It was so comforting for me. God had been
No,
preparing me for
yeah.
the
I think
loss
that
of my
sounds like
mom.
God was just, yeah, God wanted you to be there. And if you could have orchestrated I mean, you don't want to, I don't know, maybe we do want to celebrate it. But if you could orchestrate the moments leading up to your mother's death, how that played out had to be a pretty great way for that to happen.
True. And it's interesting. I would not have asked ahead of time, God, let me be in my mom's presence when she dies. Let me be there by myself because I was, but I
Yeah.
didn't feel alone. I felt the
Yeah.
presence of God right there as I physically saw my mom go from this life into eternity.
Yeah.
It's still like, wow, that's amazing to me. I grieved there for a little bit by myself. And then I thought, well, okay. I began to make phone calls and make the statement, Mom has died. I have four other
Mm.
siblings, and
Yeah.
called my wife. And then I sat there for a few hours with her body before they could pick the body up. And it wasn't weird, Michael, like I thought it
Yeah.
would be. That's an area where I've experienced death. But also several years ago, probably I think 21 years ago, this month, in fact, as I think about it, a guy named Gary, they'd called hospice in. He was terminal with cancer. And so I had never met Gary before. He would have been old enough to be my dad, I believe, at the time. But he was good friends with my younger brother for many years. My brother was good friends with their family. My brother called me, he was out of state, and said, hey, Gary has been battling cancer. He has hospice and he only has a certain amount of time left. So anyway, he said, Chris, would you go visit with Gary? And of course, I said yes, but I didn't want to, Michael. This guy's
Hmm.
dying. We're strangers, although we had heard about one another for many years. So I called his wife and she said, Chris, we know who you are. Yes, come on out. And so I get in the car and I arrive and they greet me. They were so kind. He's in a hospice bed there in the living room. She sits down and I'm sitting on a sofa right across from the bed he's lying in. And as I'm sitting there, a little introduction conversation, and I really felt like the Lord, God told me, ask him how Gary feels about dying.
Mm.
And I'm thought, have you ever had conversations with God in your head in front of people?
Yeah.
This is one of those moments. I said, God, I'm not doing that. I don't know this man. That's so personal. I cannot ask him that. And it came back. I need you to ask him how he feels about dying. And boy, it was a struggle. But I knew God was saying, Chris, I've got something here.
Hmm.
So anyway, I took a deep breath and I said, well, Gary, I want to ask you something. How do you feel about dying? And it still gets me in a good way. He began to weep. This big man,
Hmm.
he was a tall man, began to just weep. And he told me, Chris, you're the first person who has asked me that.
Yeah.
And he thanked me for that. It's like sometimes we're afraid, and I've been there before, we're afraid to ask someone the obvious. You're
Yeah.
dying, you're in this bed, they've given you a certain amount of time. How do you feel about dying? And you know
Hmm.
what that did? That opened up. We were total strangers. We became, I won't say best friends, we became like old friends so quickly.
Hmm.
And I'd go back out there for the next few weeks. We'd read scripture together. We'd pray. We'd just talk about different things of life. And we got so close in about a 6-week period.
Yeah.
And I got to speak at his funeral, and it was an incredible experience for me. It's interesting. I thought I was going out there to comfort a man and his wife.
Hmm.
God used them to really impact me deeply through Gary's preparation for his own death. Yeah.
Yeah. That's good.
Recently, so I discovered that I had a young cousin. So I would be old enough to be his dad, an older dad, but he was 19, and we met just a few months ago, and we'd never known about one another because we'd never lived in the same state. A lot of complicated story, but he was basically in foster care most of his life or juvenile homes and just a really troubled life. So he came to Oklahoma where I live, living in another town, and we found out about one another through the death of his dad. recently. And so I went to the funeral, met this young man who was my cousin, again, very young to be my cousin, but we began a friendship. We'd
Yeah.
meet and we'd talk on the phone. And again, a complicated situation, but I saw so much hope. He was actually shot and killed. He was murdered just a few weeks ago at the recording of this episode. And I tell you, that really grabbed me. And I was like, he told me, Chris, I really want a relationship with you. I want a sense of community, but I don't know what that's like. And as I've processed this a lot over the last few weeks, I think it's been 5, maybe 6 weeks since he was killed. And I'd just seen him a few days before that. One thing it's done for me is this. I don't want to waste time, Micheal. We were supposed to talk on the phone, I think the day before he died. I had something come up and I pushed it aside. Not that that was a bad thing, but it was a reminder for me, we're not promised more time. And so I want to seize the day with people. And it's been incredibly humbling for me with the loss of this young man. And not that he just died, but how he died has been really disturbing for me. So
to have it be a real sudden, violent end like that is a lot different than what you were talking about with Gary. Knowing that you're going to die, being able to prepare for it, and being able to process it with somebody.
Yeah. So there's a lot we could talk about. In fact, we probably want to make this 2 episodes. We've already talked, what, 20 minutes, something like that. I think there's so much, and we have more notes, but I think, so we don't rush it, let's make 2 episodes out of this. Sound good?
Okay. Yeah, sounds good.
So, Micheal, I want to thank you for starting this conversation with me. And so thank you guys for listening, and thank you for listening to the Real Life Mentoring Podcast. We're going to do part 2. And so if you enjoy this podcast, if you would subscribe and like, and send us a note or 2, and maybe some topics that you would like to hear discussed. Thank you guys for listening. Real Life Mentoring.